I am realizing now that between the rain outside and the washing machine doing its absolute best, there may be a lot of white noise in this video, and if so, I apologize. So, good morning. Today we have my black journal out, which means it is time for another tag. I don't actually know if this is a tag because I haven't seen other people being tagged, but I have seen people doing it, and that is the end of year survey that was created by the Perpetual Page Turner. Now, I went to her blog, and apparently she's been doing this survey since 2010, and I was in high school. So the idea of me doing it now is kind of funny to me because I'm sure that when she first started it all these years ago, there would not be tons and tons of bloggers and booktubers participating in the trend, sharing books, reflecting on the year. So I thought it'd be cool to kind of jump in and share my perspective. So the first question is the best book you read in 2020. This is a hard one. Picking the best is always a hard one for me, but I feel like this has been an especially good reading year. But I'm going to have to go with Kindred by Octavia Butler. Now, I want to do a dedicated video to this book. However, of all the books I've read this year, it feels like the one that I almost feel least qualified to talk about, in the sense that it is one of the best books I've ever read, and it delves into so much nuance, so many questions about humanity and choices and morality and ethics in a situation that personally affects me, and in a situation that brings up a lot of memories and feelings about what it means to be an American, the ideas of family, the ideas of relationship. And Octavia Butler's Kindred is about a woman named Dana in the year 1976 who is pulled back into time into the antebellum South in Maryland and brought to a plantation. Now, you learn very early on, literally in the first chapter, that she keeps getting pulled back to save a particular person, the son of a slave owner, and she ends up having this relationship with him throughout his entire life as she is pulled back and forth. She spends time as a slave, she spends time as a freed woman, her husband comes back with her on some cases, she's alone in some cases. It is an incredibly intense, difficult book to read that also challenges a lot of my personal thoughts about how I assumed I would act if I lived in the times of slavery as a modern Black woman, but also questions of race and interracial relationships and empathy and generational trauma. It is a lot, but it is so incredibly written that it is impossible to put down. I finished this in 2 days and I was just devouring this book. It is something that I desperately want to reread in another time. However, reading such depictions of slavery, especially as a Black woman, were incredibly difficult. And I don't feel at all that Octavia Butler was gratuitous in the way she talked about them. I don't think any of it was for shock value. It was all very intentional, very strategic. And as someone who has intentionally read a lot about enslaved peoples, who have read a lot about those times, as someone who lives in the South, I could see where she had done her research. I could see where she was referencing Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman and challenging certain conceptions we have about enslaved times, while also reinforcing certain things that seem to have been dulled by the passage of time, of how vicious and unfair a lot of these things were. This is one of the best books I have ever read, period. And even though I've been talking about it for a few minutes, again, I still don't feel like I'm ready to really, not sell it, but to really unpack and deconstruct why exactly I think it's so good, on top of why I think it affected me so much. But I can say for the purposes of this video, it is the best book I've read in 2020. The next book I want to talk about is a book I was excited about but didn't love, and that is Lead from the Outside by Stacey Abrams. Now, this book was originally released under the title Minority Leader, but as Stacey Abrams rose to prominence after the gubernatorial race, after all her work with registering voters in Georgia and the other women and groups that she worked with, it was re-released amid more of this hype, more of this attention. And it's part memoir of how she got to where she was, the lessons she learned along the way, the lessons she tries to impart upon the people she mentors and she works with. But there's also very, very practical information of, here's a list of websites you can go to learn more about financial literacy. Here's an example of time in which I used networking in order to get this position. And while all the information information was helpful, except for the personal information, the things about her that I previously didn't know that I did find interesting. I felt that I had heard all of this before. I felt that I had heard it in various other memoirs of people of color, of women working in different fields, certain lessons that seem to come up again and again. Now, in many ways, people will say that, there are no new ideas under the sun. It's simply about how you write them. And she is absolutely a strong writer. I did not know until I read this book that she actually has a series of romance novels under the name Selena Montgomery. So she is absolutely a strong writer. I just felt that as far as memoirs go, as far as nonfiction goes, it didn't hit me as much as some other books. And so that's why it was a book I was really excited about, but in the end wasn't my favorite. The next question is, what was your most surprising book of 2020? And for this, I'm going to go with The House on Mango Street by Sandra Cisneros. Now, I've mentioned this multiple times, but I just, again, as someone who tries to be very intentional about how they buy books, I don't know how I missed this. This book is not written in a standard narrative format. It's written more in the style of vignette and choreo poems and very poetic, curated thoughts is the way that I think about it. It follows a almost chronological narrative. Some of it bounces back and forth following this young woman growing up in a neighborhood, dealing with her family and her friends, ideas of privacy, ideas of home ownership. What does it mean to truly have a place? And I enjoyed it, but again, it just wasn't something that I was expecting. And it took me like a few pages before I realized, oh, that wasn't like the acknowledgments or the prologue. This is the form of the book. So in a very literal sense, this was the most surprising book for me of 2020. The next prompt is, what was the best book you read that is something that is normally out of your genre? And this should be no surprise to anyone, The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton. For a while on this channel and in real life, I have said that I don't really read YA. And after this book was recommended to me, a book that is by many people considered the origins of YA, following two groups of teenage boys in the American Southwest in the 1950s, the socials, the rich, the elite, the upper class, and the greasers, the poorer, lower class, on opposite sides of town. This book became one of my favorites of 2020. It was written by a woman who was 16, 17 when it was written and published. I felt like it talked about a lot of major themes that resonate as an adult, but in a way that would absolutely be understandable and relatable and palatable to teenagers. And it's something that I can recognize, even though I appreciate it now, that I would have appreciated so much more if I happened to read it when I was in that age group at a time in my life where I really felt like an outsider. And that book and the conversations around that video that I made about that book and YA on BookTube really helped open my eyes to where this idea of YA came from, why there seems to be a bit of a stigma against it, and also that YA means a lot more things than I previously thought that it did. The next prompt is, what book are you most likely to reread in 2021? Now, I've already mentioned that I want to reread Kindred by Octavia Butler, but I'd also like to put Axiom's End by Lindsay Ellis on this list. I loved this book when I read it. I made a whole video about it, and I feel like it came at the right time in my life where I was looking for something like that, something fast-paced and escapism and really interesting and fascinating. It kind of helped guide me into an interest to sci-fi, which is something I discovered this year. And even though I loved it then, again, I said I'm very aware of where I was like mentally and emotionally when I read it. So I want to reread it next year to see if I enjoy it more, enjoy it less, or enjoy it just as much. I am a serial rereader. I reread a lot of my books. And if I keep a book after reading it, it is because I most likely plan on reading it again, or I have a really strong emotional attachment to it, like the copy of The Hobbit my dad gave me that I'll probably never reread. So I want to reread this in 2021, but also I'm trying to decide if I'm going to reread it whenever I want, or if I want to try to time it for whenever we think that the sequel might come out. I don't actually know if the sequel's coming out in 21 or if it'll be in 22, but I think it's always interesting to read a sequel when you haven't read the previous book in a while. But I've also been in a situation where I intentionally timed my rereads so I could see how it felt as one continuous story. The next prompt is, what was your favorite cover of 2021? And that has to go to Fangs by Sarah Anderson. I spoke about Sarah Anderson's work in my video on the social dilemma and Instagram books. And Fangs is a departure from her previous three books of comics, of graphic novels, which were called Adulthood is a Myth, Big Mushy Happy Lump, and I forget the name of the third one, but like they're all three in a particular style. It's a style that she popularized on her Instagram that I'll leave link below. And Fangs is about the relationship between a vampire and a werewolf in 2027, I believe. It's in the future. And I love it because it's these slice of life, relationship, love, sex, jokes, spending time together. Like it's a beautiful little romance book, but also I love the puns and the references to horror genres and the little things that you might not expect because it's a relationship between two monsters in the future or in modern times. It is exactly what I wanted it to be. But what I was not expecting was the cover. It is a simple black and red with the main woman character on the front. And if you touch it, it's not velvet, but it has a texture to it that I really love. It feels nice on your hands. And on the back, all it says is, I want your love, with love crossed out and like blood written underneath. It's very simplistic. There's no endorsements from other authors. There's no, summary on the back. And I really love that. The simplicity of it totally matches the tone. The story starts with the woman character, so it makes sense that she's the one on the cover, Elsie, as opposed to who becomes her lover, Jimmy. And it just looks great. Like I have it propped up on one of my shelves right now, and I know it's something I'll probably reread every Halloween. And it's just, there were a lot of great covers I love this year, but the simplicity of this one and how well it matched the tone of the book, I think knocked it out of the park. The next prompt is, who was your most memorable character of 2020? And for this prompt, I chose Sula from Toni Morrison's novel, Sula. Now, I am very, very sure that if I met Sula in real life, I probably wouldn't like her, since the way we choose to navigate the world is very different, but she is fascinating and specific and strong and stubborn. She can be cruel. Oh gosh, she can be vicious. She is always honest, and I love learning about her. Sula, the book, is about Sula, but it's really about the relationships between her and her best friend, her and the mother figures in her life, her and the men in her life. There are so many conversations about what it means to be a woman, how to be a woman, the different ways that women choose to navigate, the choices they make, the pros and cons of them to have the life they want to lead and be the people they want to be. And Sula chooses a very specific and controversial path. The final chapter of the book, the majority of it is a conversation between Sula and her current/former best friend, and it was a punch in the gut to read and to look at both sides and see points of merit in both of the women's arguments. But at the end, wonder, whose life would you choose? As a Black woman living in modern times, it is set in the past, but still modern for the most part. Which life would you choose when the choices for women then and now are so limited? This is a book I also want to reread in 2021, because as with all of Toni Morrison's works, I want to say, at least one level above me. I enjoyed them. I feel like I understand the majority of them, but every time I read them, it's not like, oh, I like this less, or it's the same. I always love it more because I caught something else. I understood something differently. Something resonated with me in a different way. So I will absolutely be rereading this book in 2021, and Sula is hands down my favorite character. Our next prompt is, what was the most unique book you read in 2020? And for this one, I chose My Year of Rest and Relaxation by Ottessa Moshfegh. This book is about a unnamed, unreliable, very unlikable character who is rich and privileged and spoiled, but is sick of the world, clearly struggling with some mental health issues. But as opposed to finding a doctor or a therapist, or really anybody in her life who has some damn sense and could help her, she decides to take matters into her own hands, find a shady a shady psychologist, psychiatrist. Psychiatrists are the ones that can write prescriptions, finds a shady psychiatrist and concocts a plan to be unconscious for as much of a year as she can. Drugs, locking herself in her apartment, hiring people to leave pizzas outside the door, going on these wild, ridiculous adventures when she's under the influence, where she has no idea how she got this fur coat, how she ended up on this train, what happened to the DVDs in her apartment that she rewatches obsessively in order to calm herself. This book is just a train wreck unfolding in front of you. And half the time I had no idea what was going on and how it would end. And the ending, even in itself, was, I'm not going to say satisfying, but it fit the tone of the book. And I was like, what is this? What was this that I just experienced? And I was ready to experience again. I don't feel like anybody I've seen talk about this book really does it justice, because if we got into the nitty gritty of the moments that really made us gasp or made us laugh or made us cringe or just made us go, what is she doing? I think it would ruin some of that for the person who's going to read it next. But this book, I first heard about it on Ariel Bassett's channel, and it was absolutely the most unique book I've read in 2020, and one of probably the most unique books I have ever read. I cannot think of a single other character, a single other type of novel that I would put in this genre besides other work I've read by Ottessa Moshfegh. And our final question, our final prompt for this end of year survey is, what is one of your favorite quotes or passages from any book you've read this year? This was, in the first question, very difficult for me. But the one that popped in my head, even amongst all these thoughts, and even when I went scrolling through my screenshots, the one that really struck me, because I feel like it not only the fact that I memorized it the second I heard it, but also I feel like it perfectly ties into what 2020 was like for me, is from Parable of the Sower by Octavia Butler. And that quote is, all that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Now, while I wouldn't declare myself a convert of Earthseed, I cannot deny how true and right and holy and just universal this passage feels to me, because it's the same thing that so many other poets and writers and actors and politicians and people throughout history have said. I have heard this sentiment from my own father's mouth, from, as I said, the mouths of people who've been dead for hundreds of years, but just the way that she crystallized it and in the context in which you hear it, in this book about a young girl trying to build a community and trying to survive as she travels across a broken America. The only lasting truth is change. That is the only thing any of us can ever 100% depend on. That eventually, always, in ways big, small, or otherwise, things will change. And that everything you interact with, you change. And by that interaction, you yourself are evolving and changing as well. I think this could be applied to any time in any year. As I said, I think it's a sentiment that's been around for a long time, but especially in 2020, when I personally went through some very major shifts in terms of work and school and perception and health. And on top of that, all that happening amongst a backdrop of so much change globally, but also in our country, I cannot think of a better quote, a better passage, a better way to end 2020 or a way to end this survey. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll leave the Perpetual Page Turners information in the description. And you should know that this survey has like 50 questions or something. There's a lot of questions on it. So I just went through and picked the 10 that I found the most interesting, that I thought would let me talk about the most books, because a lot of my books seem to answer a lot of the prompts. So you can really make this your own. And if you decide to do it, please let me know. Once I first discovered her blog, I've been going through and watching tons of end of year survey videos. So we're almost at the end. I'm filming this in December. I have no idea when I'll actually put it up, but this year, I think I can speak for myself and everyone in my life. We are ready for change. So with that in mind, have a good one.